Hey everyone, on this episode of Teeter Talks, I had so much fun chatting with my friend Jamie Burr. He is a sports scientist, but he's also the VP of high performance for the Chicago Blackhawks hockey team. His resume is beyond impressive, and he has done so much cool research around high performance. We even get into what is high performance and living an optimal life, not just in elite sport, but in everyday how we show up. He shares what it's like working with professional athletes, with Olympic athletes, but also with everyday person in looking to enhance and optimize how they show up in the world. We had a really great conversation. And if you didn't know, Jamie is also married to my best friend, and we chat a little bit about her too. Everyone, please enjoy my conversation with Jamie Burr. Hey, Jamie, how's it going?
Morning, Marissa. Great to see you.
You too. This is a real treat for me. I am excited to interview you. I've known you for a very long time. You are a very interesting cat. You have a lot of impressive titles on your resume, but I have to say, the most impressive thing about you and that I adore most is that you are married to my best friend.
One of my greatest accomplishments.
Yes, that should be on your resume. Actually, let's put that on your LinkedIn.
I actually think it is
So,
at the bottom.
is it? Well, there you go. No, we've known each other. I was doing the quick mental math this morning, like 22, 23 years. I think we've known each other, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And I now live in your hometown that you grew up in, which is awesome. It's our worlds have collided, and you've been doing a lot of amazing things. It's been fun to watch you as a friend, and just really someone who's really admired the work you've done, and just how you show up as a person, which is why I had to have you here on this podcast. So you are a sports scientist, but you are also the VP of performance for the Chicago Blackhawks. So before we dive into exactly what those things mean and what you do every day, tell me a little bit about your thoughts on high performance. Like, why as a society are we so obsessed with high performance? And I have to say, like, even in my work as an executive coach, I look to work with people who are focused on high performance. And it's not that I'm looking for people who are the best. It's really people who want to do better and perform at their best. What are your thoughts on high performance?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the nice introduction. You're making me blush to start. But I think high performance to me is, everybody wants to perform, right? Everybody
Yeah,
wants, maybe not everybody. People that we hang around with tend to want to do well at what they do. To me, high performance is sort of that next step, right? It's
yeah,
optimization, whether that be in your job or when I'm working with elite athletes. I mean, that's what makes them elite. They're sometimes it's making sacrifices or prioritizing things over others to truly do better. Elite performers in whatever world we talk about are rare by definition. So I think that's really what high performance is all about. I also think, I think sometimes those terms these days get maybe a little overused too. There's nothing wrong. You can't be a high performer in everything you do all the time. But today everything has to be like over the top amazing, and maybe it's the
yeah.
Facebook effect. But
It's true. I'm super, I love talking about success on this podcast. A lot of my guests, like just how that definition of success, what does that even mean? Like, I think success looks different to a lot of people. I think sometimes we peg the wrong things as being successful. And I think high performance could fall into that category too, where it probably looks different for everybody. Like my version of high performance is probably very different than yours. I mean, mine does not include a treadmill or a bicycle or any of the other things that you like to do in your spare time. But I do. Even in my world, I work with people who just want to optimize how they show up, and in whatever category of life, be it a parent, in your community, as a leader, at work, in life. So I think it's really interesting that there is this focus on this. I mean, performance enhancement is not a new term to anybody. I mean, there's drugs, there's cars. Talk about anything we can do to maximize performance, but it just seems to be more buzzworthy as of late.
totally, and I think you hit on a really important point there. Like, what is performance? Well, it depends on what we're talking about. I mean, even if we just focus on some of the elite athletes that we've had the
Mm-hmm.
pleasure of working with, the key performance indicators are very different, right? So,
Mm.
uh, in my own world, not that I'm elite by any means, but I like to focus on endurance type activities. If I were to go play hockey with some of the hockey players I work with, my performance would be terrible. I'm
Right.
fit enough, but not that kind of fitness, right? And like, what makes a good hockey player or leader or whatever that might be? That's what I think about when I think about optimization, right? Like, how do you work towards that specific goal?
Absolutely. I totally agree. So you kind of talked about it a little bit. You work with professional athletes. You work with the Blackhawks NHL team, but you originally started off as a sports scientist doing a lot of work. I mean, you've been doing this for years. You have endless amounts of research studies working with athletes, working at optimizing performance. Talk to me a little bit about that work and then how you transitioned into like almost from academia to corporate, to professional sports. Talk to me a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I did start. I trained. I took kinesiology as an undergraduate
Yeah.
and worked my way through grad school. And I'm actually trained as a cardiac physiologist, which is a lot nerdier sounding. So a
I
lot of the
didn't
work that
even
we
know
do,
that. So
a lot of the work that we do deals with like how does the heart and the vasculature accomplish the things that the body needs to do during exercise. Um, that really led to me, getting involved with Olympic level athletes. Here in Guelph, we've always had very strong triathlon and running teams. And I've also worked alongside the NHL since I was a grad student. We used to run the fitness testing combine. So, I mean, I think in that it was sort of a natural progression for me in that this was the kind of work that it was interesting and people wanted to hear about it. And when the opportunity came up to work with some teams, we sort of jumped at that. And I have worked, with teams like the Maple Leafs and others for a while. And then the opportunity came up in Chicago, and it was a neat thing to try. So
it's so cool how you talk about it because you're so humble and it is so exciting. Like it's a really big deal that you've been able to take all this research and all the work you've done in the lab and really apply it out. Isn't that like an academia dream to be able to go out and use all this work and see the impact of it?
I mean, yeah, I think so. I mean, I get great pleasure from that. I'm really lucky too, Marissa, that I get to have a foot in both camps, right? Like I
Right.
wear the nerd hat. I run a research lab. I'm here at the university right now. And we ask very different questions in those two roles, right? So like tomorrow I'm getting on a plane and going back to Chicago. And the kind of problems that we're dealing with there and the things we're trying to optimize for are very different from the things that I'll deal with this afternoon in the lab. The questions that seem to make sense in those different realms. So yeah, I think it's a really neat thing to discover something in the research lab and be like, hey, there might be an application to make the best of the best that much better.
Yeah. You really, it's funny. In my research, preparing for this, even though I've known you 23 years, I still felt the need to research and prepare. I found a Google Scholar page. I didn't even know that existed. So this is basically published work and research. And I started going through it. I mean, you've done a lot in the way of chronic disease, studies with standing desks and treadmill desks, working with blood flow and the impact, cannabis and exercise. Let's pause there for a second in the spirit of really cool research. Talk to me a little bit about the work you've done around, is it with cannabis and exercise and performance?
It is. That's a fairly recent thing. And I'll be totally honest, that wasn't something that I went to find specifically. That kind of found me.
Hmm.
And it was, I'll give credit, one of my current PhD students came to me as an undergrad at the time and said, like, hey, I think we should look at this. It sounds like a really cool area. So this was around 2017, 2018, right as Canada was looking to legalize cannabis. Um,
Mm.
and long story short, we know surprisingly little about the effects of cannabis on the human body, particularly when we add another stress to that. In my world, exercise is something that we're concerned with. We've had interest from the World Anti-Doping Agency, who spends a lot of time and money testing for these things because it's a banned substance. Um, and nobody really knew what it does. Does it actually make you better? You would remember Ross Rebagliati, a Canadian who
Yeah.
tested positive
Yeah.
years ago, and it was he lost a medal. So we set out and said, why don't we look at it? Why don't we actually see what happens when people get high, um, and then they do exercise? So we did look at just cardiovascular function in general, and then we put them on a bike and had them bike as hard and fast as they could, and look at what happened.
This sounds like wine tours in wine country where you're on a bicycle. I don't know how people do that. Like, how do you drink wine and go from winery to, it just sounds like a disaster. So any just high level insights that, I mean, it's super fascinating to me because there are stories out there of people, even as of late, who tested positive, and really the arguments are, what are the chances that it actually enhanced their performance? I think our natural inclination is that it probably hindered performance, if anything. Like, but what any kind of high level insights that came out of that research?
For sure. Well, I'll give you a funny anecdote to start. I mean, there was two things that sort of caught my interest. We'd done a lot of work in ultra marathon, where
Mm,
we'd gone out into the field, and these nut bars. An ultra marathon is anything over 50 kilometers, and
it's
sometimes
insane.
we've done races that were up to 200 kilometers through the Rocky Mountains. And when I say we did them, we studied people that were doing them. But there's a culture around that where some of the athletes would come back and we'd be doing echocardiography on their heart to see what had changed. And as you're talking to them, they'd say like, "Oh yeah, well I was high for like a couple hours throughout the night," which, as an aside, sounds like a terrible thing to me. Like running through
Mm.
bear country at night, not sober. But we had no idea what that does. Like when we look at the heart, are the changes that we're seeing because of this extreme exercise, or are they because you were smoking cannabis, or some combination thereof? So that was interesting to us. And so when we first started, um, I had two PhD students working together, and we've essentially built behind me here in the lab. You can't see it, but we built a literal hot box. We had a company come in and make a chamber that, when somebody smokes inside, it basically buffers off the excess smoke. So, A, we don't set off the fire alarms here, and so they're not just constantly rebreathing it. Um, and before we had any outside participants come in, I said, "You guys have to try this on yourselves to make sure we know what we're doing and it's safe and all that kind
Oh
of
my
thing."
goodness.
So one PhD student got the other one high, essentially. And afterwards, I went up, and I was nervous about it too. I said, how'd the first test go?" And he turned to me and said, "Jamie, I was really nervous about doing this, but I knew as soon as I had finished smoking, the bike test was going to be great. I just knew it was going to be a great day." I was, awesome. Like maybe it makes you better. And that was something that these ultra marathon runners kept telling us. Like, "Oh yeah, like I run better
Interesting.
when I'm high." So I said, "Okay, well, let's see where it goes." And then I went to the other PhD student who was running the study, and I said, how did he do?" He's like, "It was terrible. It was the worst test I've ever seen." And so it was really interesting that there's this like perception of how we perform versus the reality. And his
Mhm.
watts on the bike were way lower, but he thought he did really, really well. So
This is interesting to me because although I've never run a marathon, and I sure as heck have never or will ever run an ultra marathon, I hear all the time from people that it's mind over matter, right? That, you hit whatever mark and it's really, you got to get to, from 15 to 20K. That's just, it's a mental block. And so I'm wondering if the cannabis just allows people to break through the mental block. Like imagine how many challenges in life would be easier if we just started. And if imagine cannabis was the thing that got people started, got people in the right state of mind to just do the thing that they've been dreading, or at least show up thinking they're doing a great job, which allows them to just be there and perform in the first place and work through, maybe those tougher periods. So really, it's not actually helping their physical performance, but by keeping their mind performing, it makes sure they don't stop physically
I mean,
performing. Does that make sense?
yeah, it does. It's a really interesting idea. Now, I'll say I don't study the things that happen between the ears because that scares me.
Right.
I don't know how to measure that. But there are people in my world that are suggesting, maybe we should be giving cannabis to exercisers that, the general population struggles with sufficient
Yeah.
exercise. But anybody that's, a runner or a cycler, they've heard of like the runner's high, this feeling of like a mild euphoria you get after running. There are people suggesting like we could probably amplify that through the use of, you know THC or CBD, which
Yeah.
can convert with exercise to THC as well. So it's a neat idea of like maybe we just make people feel better about exercise and they'll do better.
That's so interesting.
It's controversial, but anyway.
Yeah.
So to answer your original question, like, does dope help? We're not using it with Blackhawks, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's a
Well,
banned
thank you for
substance.
stating that clearly on the record. Yes.
Yes. But it is interesting that, like, these ultra marathon runners, they're fit athletes for sure, but a lot of it is just not stopping. So I think your idea of like maybe just getting the brain to accept what you're doing, there could actually be value there. But at high exercise outputs, like we were testing in the lab, it actually affects cardiac function. So heart rate gets
Hmm.
artificially elevated to begin with, and it appears to make it worse, not better. So maybe, if it's just keeping going at a moderate pace, there might be something there. I can't suggest it for any typical athletes.
Well, it's good to know because I think, we have a whole generation of kids that are coming up these days who are playing sports and they're growing up in a world here in Canada where cannabis is legal. And, there's probably many mixed messages around, using it to relax and sleep well, which should help, improve your sport, but maybe it doesn't. And, you know, ultimately, probably just best to stay away from, not knowing how it will increase your performance or improve or hinder or impact your performance as an athlete. But I do think our kids are going to have an interesting time making decisions for themselves, given that it's legal now and it's just a different environment.
I think so too, and I think our generation, and even more so those older than us, um, we probably struggle a little bit with this idea. Like, we've grown up and it's been illegal, and it's this taboo topic.
Yeah,
I'm not promoting the use of cannabis
right.
necessarily, but I mean, when we look at how well accepted alcohol is and the negative effects
Mhm.
it has on our health and performance
Yeah,
and those things, it's an interesting thing, right? It probably can't
yes.
be worse. So,
Yeah. It's so interesting. And gosh, we could probably talk about that for the next 45 minutes, but we won't because I want to go back to research because I know your face lights up and you've done a lot of really cool research. And one of the things you love is this idea of pushing the boundaries of what we know. And you've done some pretty cool research and projects in this space around blood flow restrictions, specifically with Rowing Canada and working with Olympic athletes. And I also want to talk about that time you purposely put your leg in a cast, but we'll come back to that.
okay, those are actually somewhat related topics. But yeah, I mean, I do light up when we think about like pushing the boundaries of what we know, and that's sort of what I alluded to before. As a researcher, I get to ask questions that we humans don't know the answer to, and I think that's pretty exciting, right? Like to figure out something that matters and can hopefully affect people other than just my own interest.
Hmm.
And one of the areas that we've put a lot of effort into is this idea of blood flow restricted training. So let's start there. It's as bad as it sounds. Essentially, what we do is we use tourniquets and we cut off blood flow to a limb, an arm, or a leg, or both, and then we have people exercise that limb. And it's not fun. It's people
Although
like to
your
refer.
face is completely glowing as you talk about this, but keep going. Yes, it's not
I have
fun.
done it to myself many
I know
times,
you have.
and yeah, people like to think of these things as like a biohack, right?
Yeah.
Which we can touch on that later if you'd like. But it's not a hack. It's not like we're cheating exercise because it takes very light exercise and makes it feel very hard.
Mm.
But that is kind of the cool thing that happens is you can lift a very light weight or do a very low intensity aerobic exercise, and you get this massively amplified response. Um, so that's really where it started. Was how do we use this for like rehabilitation? And it is widely used now.
Mm.
This is something we do see in elite sports all the time. You go to a physio clinic, chances are they're starting to do this where somebody can't lift a heavy weight, but they need to keep that muscle mass and that strength up. Well, now we can just cut off some blood flow, do something they can do, and we still get this desired response. So that's kind of where it started. And fast forward a
Very
little
cool.
bit, we started to realize in early work that even though we were trying to make people bigger and stronger for all these reasons, we were actually seeing endurance benefits as well. I feel like a used car salesman when I tell people that, but it's exercise solves everything. So a lot of our work has been trying to understand that, like how does it work and why does it work? And when we talk about optimization, how do we, you know, lean into those things that really amplify that part that we want to make better? So
It's really cool. I remember a few years ago being at the gym and seeing a guy kind of tie bands on his arms. Like ultimately, I could tell he was cutting off his blood flow. And it's interesting now to understand that what he was doing, to your point, was maybe he had an injury. He wasn't able to. I mean, he was a big guy. He could tell he knew his way around a gym, but maybe he had an injury and couldn't. He was curling basically what he was doing. He's doing curls, and so obviously maybe he couldn't do as much as he used to, or he was really testing out this theory of maybe doing less with a greater impact by reducing blood flow. Really interesting
absolutely.
stuff.
I mean, there is certainly an application to bodybuilding. Um, you know, you can only lift so much weight before you get overuse injuries and stuff too, right? So this is
Right.
appealing to bodybuilders as well. Like they go do their heavy sets, but on a lighter day, they might switch over to this. You get more of a pump if you're familiar with the
Yeah.
idea. And what's fascinating to me is when we look at a lot of exercise modalities and applications, elite athletes just don't adapt the same way because they've already made that adaptation, right? So
Mm.
it's hard to make somebody that's really good even better. So you would think that big bodybuilders or highly trained cyclists wouldn't get better using these techniques, and they do, um, shockingly so. So you mentioned the work that we did with Rowan Canada. Um, these were Olympic level athletes, and there was some data that came out of Germany that showed very light rowing on top of what they already do seemed to make junior level rowers better. And so Rowan Canada said, "What do you think? Can we make this happen?" And all we did was add in a light session twice a week on top of what they're doing. And we had 9 athletes set personal bests, lifetime personal bests. These are
Wow.
Olympic level athletes. Like that just shouldn't happen. That's the level of doping. So we're really fascinated in understanding what was it that changed and how did this happen. And the changes are really big. So
What about the duration? Like, will this shorten rehabilitation periods? Will it shorten the length of time it would typically take to show increased performance or endurance? Like, is it shortening the time frame for a response, I guess?
potentially. And again,
Yeah.
it depends on what we're targeting, but it appears that these adaptations happen much more quickly than we would expect.
Hmm.
So usually when we run an exercise trial, like 6 to 12 weeks is kind of your sweet spot to
Yeah.
see real changes. We're starting to see changes in as short as 2 weeks. Um,
Wow. Yeah.
yeah. So again, we're on the nerdy side. We're trying to figure out what is it that's changing and how does this make any sense. But I will say, like, from a rehab point of view, if somebody can lift a heavy weight, that tends to have bigger changes in the end. Like, so the
Okay.
goal isn't just to like hack exercise; it's let's get them back to full function so they can do the things that we want them to do.
Right. That's fair. I mean, I ask because it's so cool to me. Yes, you tend to do a lot of work with elite athletes and high performance athletes, but a lot of your work has practical uses for the everyday person, in terms of rehab or just performance in general. So I'm curious a little bit. Let's stay on that path around in all your work and all the years. What are some tips or tidbits that would stand out for you or for the everyday person who wants to focus on high performance in their lives, whatever that might look like? But let's maybe focus a little bit physically, maybe in the way of nutrition and wellness. What are some of your own personal Jamie Burr approved life hacks?
Sure. Um, well, I'll say I tend not to go with the hack because while
Okay.
I'd love like everybody else to believe that there's a shortcut, I think there rarely is.
Mhm.
But I actually don't think my advice for the everyday athlete is all that different from the elite athlete. Now, the approach might look a little bit different because what you're capable of doing is different, but I think fundamentally it's the same. And that's
Yeah.
focusing on the big blocks. And so, what do the big blocks mean? Here's how I explain it to our athletes. Marissa says, elite athletes are not different from other people in that they're inundated with like all these crazy ideas on YouTube and whatever else. And a lot of those things focus on what I would call like the 1%. It's
Yeah.
like, that last little thing that might make you this much better. But as I say to them, like, that's icing on the cake. So if you haven't baked a good cake, don't bother icing it, right? Because there's nothing holding it up. So to me, it's like, what are the big important things? Are you eating well most of the time, right? If we want to recover from our exercise, we got to eat well, we got to sleep well. Exercise needs to be consistent. It's got to be targeted to what we want to do. And we have to push ourselves to do a little bit better. So if we're getting like kind of those big pieces, that's going to get you 95% of the way. And I think sometimes we overcomplicate things. So I think that's kind of something I've learned, whether it's, controlling your blood glucose or getting bigger and stronger, or, we've done some work with like Parkinson's patients, keeping
Mm.
function longer over time. Um, it's doing the big picture things first.
Yeah. What about discomfort? What are your thoughts in relationship with discomfort? Because it kind of goes back to this idea of pushing the boundaries and questioning what we know, but also you mentioned it off the top, like making the sacrifices to perform. we often talk about this idea of growth comes in this space of discomfort. Like when we're uncomfortable, and I don't mean consistently uncomfortable all the time, 24/7, but we find those moments of discomfort. It's where we tend to see the results. And it sounds like a lot of the work you do puts people in that situation of discomfort, to prove that there's room for performance enhancement. What are your thoughts?
That's an interesting point. I don't think exercise should be something that we have to view negatively because it has to be not enjoyable. Um,
Hmm.
or anything else in life for that matter. But I think you make a good point that if we keep doing what we've always done, our room for growth is low, right? You'll get the same results if you keep doing what you've always done. And there is something in the exercise world called the principle of progression, right? Meaning you have to do a little bit more than you've done before, so your body gets that signal of like, we got to get better at this thing.
Right.
So, I think that's an interesting idea of like, how do we push ourselves? But having said that, and this is something, when I give talks for like exercise is medicine, an organization I'm involved with, I often get asked, what's the best exercise?
Oh, yeah.
And
What is the best exercise?
okay, I'm glad you asked. Um,
Okay.
I, maybe this seems like a cop out answer, but I think the best exercise is the one you enjoy. And
That
that
is a cop out answer, Jamie.
it does sound that way, but it's like, why do I say that? Because it's this idea of discomfort. Like,
Yeah.
if you don't like something, whether it be a diet or an exercise, whatever, your likelihood to keep doing it is very low because it's
Yeah.
work. But if you find something that you really like and you want to keep going back and doing it, then it's easy to push yourself to do a little bit more or a little bit faster or whatever it might be. So,
That's
I don't know.
fair.
The example I always give is like, I heard swimming is a great exercise because it's full body and whatever. Should I swim? Like, can you swim?
Can you swim?
Because if the answer is no, it's a terrible exercise. You'll do it once.
So this is really interesting because as you're saying that, where my mind goes, staying on this idea of discomfort, but also doing what you enjoy, is that maybe the discomfort should come in preparing and focusing on what you're doing that you enjoy. So I say that, and I think where my mind went was this idea of I love drinking various types of protein smoothies, and people have seen me drink them, right? People in meetings, people wherever I go, and they're like, "Oh, those look so disgusting. It's green." Like, if it was disgusting, do you think I would drink it every single day? Like, I mean, maybe some people do that and they like plug their nose. I've seen people plug their nose and chug it back, but I have found a way to make high protein foods that are important for me healthy, but also delicious. Like I try to tell this to people all the time. I'm like, if you are changing your diet, put the work in to find recipes that you enjoy that are better. Like that's where the discomfort should come, not the discomfort of putting something in your mouth and in not enjoying eating it. Or to your point, figure out the exercises that you like. So take the time to build a proper exercise routine, push yourself through those exercises. Like maybe that's where the discomfort needs to be in the preparation and the evaluation, not in the actual act itself. Does that make any sense?
I totally agree. And I think this comes back to this idea of like foundation, right? Like,
Yeah.
let's stick with the diet. That's a common question that people ask too. Like, what's the best diet? Well, it's a 1% change if it's something that like is painful to do, that you have to like choke it down, or
Yeah.
it's like the soup diets. Like, how long are you going to do that for? A couple days? It's really hard. That's not a
Are you
lifestyle
saying
change.
that because your wife did a really funny soup diet when we were in university, the cabbage soup
I
diet, and she
briefly
lasted like
recall that
10
story.
minutes?
But that's a perfect example, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe it does something up at the very last little bit
Yes.
when you're preparing. I don't know what you'd be preparing for, but if you can make these changes of something that like, hey, I like this. This is
Yeah.
a thing that is a lifestyle change as opposed to something I'm just going to do in the short term. Now we're talking foundation, right? That's something you do day in
Yeah.
day out. Over time, you'll see the change.
Yeah. I really like that. And I think that applies to performance in life in general, not just in sports or fitness or exercise, but it's figuring out that consistency, that like what are the foundational elements that make me me, like how I show up at work, how I show up for my family. What are the things that are non-negotiables? What are the things that I need to establish as my building blocks? And then to your point, what's the 1%? What's the other thing that I can do to really crank this up a notch every once in a while? And that might look different to everybody or might look different depending on the day. But there's something about building that foundational work that obviously is very important.
Absolutely. And you know what I'm a big fan of, and this might not surprise you, Marissa, but making hard decisions easy, right? So
Yeah.
I know in our friend group, I have the reputation of being like the crazy exerciser or whatever. That's fine.
You are a crazy exerciser.
Well, I'm going to share some with you. Like I'm just like everybody else, but like, why do I run to the office or bike to the office? Because I've made the decision ahead of time to make that the easy choice. So
Right.
I intentionally don't buy a parking pass at the university. Um, that's another thing. It's great to save $1,000 a year, but I do that because then when I wake up in the morning, my choice is like, are you going to get on the city bus? Hell no, right? So
Pass.
you
Yeah.
so what is the easy
Yeah.
choice? The easiest choice and the fastest way to get there right now is to hop on your bike and just go. And then I get there and remind myself, hey, you feel great. I
Yes.
have a
It wasn't
shower
that
inside
bad.
my office, which is nice. But those things are kind of in place so that the easy choice is one that I want to make. So like,
Yeah.
it's not that I wake up and be like, heck yeah, like it's cold out, let's get on my bike. It's this is the easiest thing you can do right now. Just get it done.
That's a really great way of looking at it. I think a lot of us fight that and we hum and haw and we negotiate with ourselves and it's one of those things. I heard this expression. It's our self-confidence is keeping the promises we make to ourselves. And I think there's something about showing up and just doing the things we said we were going to do, even if it's not, we didn't say them to other people, but we told ourselves we were going to do them and we just show up and do it. So I do think you're also a crazy exerciser, which let's stay on that topic for a second. So you
Okay.
obviously do a lot of research and on this topic of wellness. How important is it for you to walk the talk and be the brand? Like, is it important for Jamie Burr? I mean, I know hold on. We will also go back to you putting your leg in a cast voluntarily. But how important is it for you to be what you are researching and studying?
Okay. These are maybe not unrelated thoughts, but why did I put my leg in a cast? I try to
Mm-hmm.
help out. I have a large group of postdocs and PhD students and master students, and I try to show them that, like, yep, like I'll do it too because
Yeah.
we do team-based science here, and I'm part of the team, so let's go. When I put my leg in a cast, so it was a 2-week immobilization study, and the idea
Mm-hmm.
was to see if we could use some of these techniques that we're developing. In this case, we were using the blood flow restriction that we were talking about with an electrical stimulation of the muscle. So we would do nothing. We would just shock the muscle after we cut off blood flow to see if that would stop the muscle from wasting away and from losing strength. Short answer is it worked. It's pretty cool. I think there's some neat applications there. But I agreed to be in the control group who got no treatment and just essentially wasted away for 2 weeks. Um, what I didn't think of is that my wife and I were moving houses at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I
You
was
also
on,
have 3 children. Yeah.
yeah, so it wasn't the greatest idea. But I mean, that's why I do those things. Do I think I have to walk the walk? Honestly, I don't feel an external pressure to do that so that I look the part of exercise physiologist or trainer or whatever people want to think. I think I do it because, and I think this is probably pretty common of people that have my type of role. Um, we think and talk about this stuff all day, every day, and
Mm-hmm.
the value. It's more than just like oh, you should do this. Like you should eat well, you should sleep lots.
Right.
Everybody knows that, but you really see the benefits and what happens when you don't.
Right.
I think that's part of it. I think maybe more positively though, it's something I enjoy, and
Yeah.
like I don't do exercises that I don't like. I despise golf. I avoid it at all costs.
Me
Things
too.
like that. So
Yeah. Well, it's wonderful. I mean, I hope everyone is spending their days in their careers, in their work, whatever that looks like, doing stuff that they enjoy, and then hopefully that translates into your life outside of it and has positive benefits, whatever that looks like. So I would imagine if you're around this stuff all the time, it's almost like you know too much to not do the right things, or you're acutely aware when you're doing the things that maybe are not optimal for you. So I think it's a wonderful thing, and I think it speaks to your leadership. And something I really love about you again is just how you show up in life, the type of person that you are. You are that type of leader that gets your hands dirty in the work that you do and gets your leg casted. I remember Cassie calling me and saying, my husband's in a cast. And I thought, oh gosh, what happened? She goes, no. He put it on himself. He just fully voluntarily put his leg in a cast and he's hobbling around the house. So, oh my goodness. But I think that's the type of person you are, is that you're in it, you get your hands dirty, you're involved. Um, Talk to me a bit about your leadership style as you work with your students, as you work with, your team at the Blackhawks, the other professionals that you've amassed to serve and support the team. How would you describe your leadership style, and what do you think makes a good leader?
Yeah, great question. First of all, I'll start by saying like I don't hold myself up as a great leader necessarily. I do my best, and that's for other people to decide. But my approach, I think, is very team based, and
Mm,
I try to avoid a hierarchy, if that
mm,
makes sense. I do think there is a necessary hierarchy, for lack of a better word, in that the buck stops with me because I'm in charge. So if we screw up, my fault. I didn't help you well enough. But I do think this is why I jump in and cast my leg, or we can talk about it later if we want to. We ended up doing a study in Spain
hmm
where we were putting in arterial and venous catheters and doing exercise, and in that case, it was a very expensive study in terms of time and money to run, and we lost somebody, and the study was at risk of not being as successful as it could have unless I jumped in and did it. So
Yes.
to me, it's
I wasn't going to bring that up because I'm pretty sure you had to shave your entire body to do that. And I was like, maybe that's too personal, but you went there. So, yes, you jumped into this crazy study on the other side of the world just so that it would happen.
yeah, and I think that sort of is how I think about that as my role in the team, right? If I'm going to ask
Yeah.
you to do it, I've got to be willing to do it myself. Um, Maybe that relates to this idea we were talking about with exercise too, of like I think I learn a lot from doing these
hmm
things and experimenting on myself as well. So I think that's part of it. I think my role as a leader, the way I view it, is in helping others see things and understand things that they may not see or understand themselves. Whether
Yes.
that's their capacity to do hard things, or when they're struggling with something, to kind of give them that push that they might need. And I do try to model that myself. So I think that's sort of my approach.
I absolutely agree. I think there's something too about the work that you're doing and how you do it that requires dedication and motivation. Like you're not asking people to sit in a room and, you know, I don't know, slide Cheerios from one side of the table to the other and to do, you know what I mean? You're asking people to really do mentally and physically tasking tasks to, collect data that's going to inform really important projects or initiatives. So there's a certain element of you having to keep people focused and motivated and, engaged for that 6 to 12 week study. Talk to me a little bit about that, about just how you keep people focused and engaged and ultimately accountable throughout these studies.
Yeah, great question. First, I'll say like I don't take credit for that. I mean, it's not the Jamie Burr show. Um, I mean, yes, I'm the principal investigator here, but I have a great team of students and trainees that really do the day to day. And it's hard, right? Like anything that we do in human research has to be voluntary, and we tell people that regularly, right? Like sometimes we pay them, sometimes we don't, but we remind them like you don't have to do anything you don't want to do, and you can drop out at any time. And I think our approach, my lab's approach, is like we try to make it fun, right? Like yes, it's hard work, and yes, we're often asking you to do uncomfortable things. That are uncomfortable in the moment, and sometimes you're sore afterwards, and like a sane person might just say, I'm done, I'm dropping out. So, I want it to be a nice place to come in and like have a good conversation. Like we can talk to
Yeah.
people as real people. And I think that's true in work with elite athletes too, right? It's like just treating people as you'd want to be treated. That's an interesting sort of aside, but like I find that's a reality in elite athletics. People look at them as celebrities, which they
Mm,
are oftentimes, but they're real people too, right? Um, they just want to talk about the football game while we're doing whatever
right.
it is we got to do. So I think, yeah, it's a reality of human research. Um, I kind of joke though too that we get pseudo normal people. People that sign up for our studies are not always your average person, right? Like you have to want to understand your maximal fitness or
Right.
see the value in doing that thing to get the answer. So,
Right.
um,
Fair.
yeah.
Fair. As you're talking, I'm thinking, is there a world like in the corporate world where we could, people who are engaged in really important work, tell them, well, you don't have to do this work if you don't want to. And then I'm thinking how you reframe that, right? Like, how do you position work as a leader to your team to say, yeah, you may not enjoy doing this piece of it, but this is why it's really important. And this is why the end result of this work is critical. And, although it may not be your primary task to keep people motivated on track, it is what you're doing as a leader by keeping heavily engaged in the work that's happening, keeping people accountable. But I think that's really interesting. So people will get very mad at me if we don't talk about your role with the Blackhawks, because it's really cool. And you've mentioned you have worked with other professional teams as well in various capacities. What has that experience been like? And what have some of the highlights been? So you're going on you're in year 2 now, season 2.
Yep.
And you work with, one of the top draft picks in previous years. And what has that experience been like for you?
Yeah, it's been really cool, and I think I sort of touched on this before, that something I really enjoy about it is that it's very different from what I do in day to day, as
Right.
a researcher. And it's really rewarding, kind of seeing things that we've worked on for a number of years start to break through in that
Mm.
world. I also find there's a lot of transfer. I mean, when we talk about leadership and those kind of things, I'll talk in generalities here, but something that is true of hockey, of NHL hockey, and probably all through hockey, is that one of the great things about it is it's steeped in tradition.
Mm.
One of the less great things about it is that it's steeped in tradition. Right? We do
Yeah.
things the way that we've done them because that's the way we do them in hockey. So there's a resistance to change on some things, but coming in with a slightly different perspective, I wouldn't. I've been around hockey a long time, but I'm not a hockey guy, right? Like, so I can come in and be like, hey, you know what I've seen in this other Olympic sport? Like, this is how they do it. What if we tried that? Like, what if we tried something similar to that? I'll give you an example. We had somebody get injured. I won't say who, but my job was to help them be ready to hit the ice when the injury had healed. And we were working on some, I'm standing on the bench with a stopwatch, essentially. We're bag skating, if you know what that is. It's conditioning on ice. And the tactical coach who I really liked there had come to me and said, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Like, what do you think? And he had approached it as a hockey guy, as you would. And I kind of looked at it I think about it in energy systems, right? Like, what do we want to optimize? This is the thing. So we can do this based on intensity and time. And if I'm honest with you,
Mm.
Marissa, my approach was, let's do a track workout. I didn't say that, but it was something we'd done with Athletics Canada when I worked with them. And it was like, this is effective. I know it's effective. It affects the body in this way. And it was funny to me because, they looked at it like, this is revolutionary. Like, it's not. It's been around 50 years. We're just using it in a different context in a way that we know will work. So,
That's really cool. And again, I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but there is something really cool about bringing in a sports scientist from Canada who's doing all this work to a team in the US, to this large franchise, and saying, well, no, he's never actually done this specific type of work before, but he's done so much other work that could have relevant applications. And when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, I think our focus has gotten way too narrow on checking boxes to have one of each, or, on appearances, but instead looking at people's backgrounds and skill set and how that can be cross applied. Like, what are the best practices from this industry or this type of work that we can apply to our work? And I think that's really cool. It's funny that you won't call it a track workout and you have to dress it up and give it a fancy name that sounds very hockey-esque. But I think that's where the excitement is. So what about just the culture of being there? Like, in terms of seeing them, the performance attitude, the high performance. I mean, are these individuals, and I ask this question because I'm really obsessed with the Netflix documentaries. I watched Quarterbacks last year, and I'm watching Receivers this year. And it's really cool to see them play football. It's actually funny to watch this documentary with my husband because he remembers what happened in every game from last season because they're a season behind. And I'm like, yeah, I don't care if they won or lost, although he knows exactly what happens. It's watching these guys rehab and train behind the scenes that I find really cool. Like rehab injuries, how they're doing it, how they're training on a specific thing, if it's, their speed, whatever it is. is there a culture of these individuals, like at the Blackhawks specifically or in professional sports, where there's a real openness to coming at things differently? Because some of these guys are doing like Reiki healing and like, you talked about energy, like they're all over the place. Is this just because they're willing to try anything? Or do you think someone is prescribing and, there's kind of a synergistic approach now and that's more widely accepted?
Ooh, yeah, there's a lot wrapped up in that. We could talk about this for the
That was a
whole
very
hour.
long question. Yeah.
I will say, and I think this is true of all professional sports, um, is there's a lot of people that want to have a touch with those athletes, right?
Mm.
A lot of people are selling something, frankly, whether
Yeah.
they realize they're doing it or not. There's a lot of snake oil out there. I mean, part of my job with the Blackhawks, if I can say it this way, is I'm a bullshit detector. So the
Mm.
guys in the business side are regularly sending me, hey, this company reached out, they're offering us this or whatever. Like, does it make sense? A lot of the time, the answer is no. It makes sense
Mhm.
for them because they
Sure.
can make a buck by being affiliated with a high profile team.
Of
Does it
course.
make sense to us? Maybe not. So one of the things that I've told coaching staff and players is my approach as the guy in charge of high performance is that we're not going to waste time and other resources like energy thinking about things or whatever if they don't make sense. So I'm
Yeah.
not expecting that every player knows what does and doesn't work, but like that's partly my job. Like that thing doesn't make sense. I'll give you an example because I've seen this before. Uh, Alkaline water, right? Not that this came
Ooh,
up
yes.
specifically, but I've heard people talking about the pH of water. Like we're not going to spend any brain power on that. And I'll tell you why. We're going to drink just water because the body has three different systems to ensure that cannot be effective. It is that important to our body to get that right that like that's a waste of we're not paying more money. We're not going to think about which one to pull out of the fridge. We'll stock the fridge with water. It works. So those are the kind of things that I see.
Yeah.
So in any of these sports, as you've probably seen in this, whether it's hockey or football, in the off season, typically players will go and train with their guy, whoever their guy is. Sometimes they have different ideas than we might, and I think that's where people like me have a role of like, okay, let's work through like critically thinking, like what do we know, what don't we know, why might that work, why might it not?
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, they're very dedicated to the craft. So
Yeah.
to your original question, like what do I see in the dressing room? I mean, these are the best of the best, and the amount of effort and whether it's mental or physical or whatever, like these guys, the intensity that they bring is truly impressive. That's something I pass along to my kids who are aspiring hockey players. Is this is what it takes? Like
Yeah. And I think work ethic, to your point, going back to that, what really matters. I mean, work ethic will outperform any type of biohack any day of the week, would be my guess. And I love that you brought up alkaline water because we could probably have a whole other podcast dedicated to all these different fads and these things, the supplements, the nutrition, and sometimes I think we do it to ourselves because as soon as you see something on social media and you show any type of interest and it just gets fed to you from the algorithm. So you're like, well, everybody's eating cottage cheese. Everybody's drinking alkaline water. Everybody's, insert whatever exercise or fad here. So, that critical thinking piece is really important, is that we really need to go back and figure out what's best for us in terms of how we want to enhance our performance. And yeah, you talked about, maybe one of my final questions here for maybe all the parents out there or coaches. I mean, you do have young kids in hockey and in soccer. How do you take this information home to help them? I mean, I know you're not putting their legs in casts or cutting off their blood flow. I mean, maybe you are. I don't know exactly. I don't
no,
think you are. But what kind of advice are you using to kind of just keep an eye on how they're training and showing up as kids in sports?
yeah, this might surprise people because I mean we know each other. We're both competitive people in our own way. I like to win, whether it be at science or doing my own sports or whatever. I take a very measured approach. I think my wife and I both do of
Yeah.
how do we want our kids to do it, and what's our reason for having them in there. Our goals are not to have them make the NHL. I mean, if they did and that was their dream, great. Um,
Yeah.
but to me, it's more important. Like, are you having fun? And if you
Yeah.
decide hockey isn't fun anymore, great. Let's go do something else. Because I think from what I know as a scientist, like the benefits of being active and teamwork and all those great things that come with it, like far outweigh any dream of making it. Also, at the risk of being too much of a nerd, your chances of making the NHL are extremely slim, or any pro sport, right? Like it's
Yeah.
0.002% or something. So
Yeah.
there's a reality there. But when I focus as a parent and trying to help them, first of all, like just being a parent, right? Like everybody looks at my kids a little bit differently around the hockey rink because they know what I do. Um, I don't let that be it. It's like, hey, I enjoyed watching you play. That's fun. Like, and we
Yeah.
focus on, and this does come from my time around elite athletes. We focus on controlling the controllables. That's what I tell them. Like, hey, you
Mm.
look like you worked hard, right? Because you can always work hard. Now, your hard work may mean your team wins or you score goals, or maybe they're better than you, but you can't control how good they are. So let's focus on those kind of things. And, if they have questions or they want to go for a run to condition, sure, let's do it because I think there's value in understanding those things, but I don't push that.
No. I love that line about let's focus on controlling the controllables. I mean, I think in life, we could all take a page from that book and focusing and going back to those fundamentals, right? Like, let's focus on the things we can control. Let's make those things enjoyable. And I think the confidence that you build with that solid foundation will allow you to go out and tackle the things that you can't control because you're so confident in certain things you can, and you've built up the ability to handle those accordingly. I love that. Control the things. What was it again? Control the things you
Control the
can.
controllables, yeah, and I think
Control the controllables. Wow, that was sad. Yeah.
you're right though. It does apply like in all sorts of different sports and
Yeah.
in settings and yeah, and I think like not worrying about the things that you can't change anyways is
Yeah.
a easier said than done.
Easier said than done. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
an important like
Yeah.
life lesson and dealing with people too.
Yeah. It's so true. And it's great advice for kids, elite athletes, and everybody in between. Um, People can find you. I think you're active on Twitter, you're on LinkedIn. You have a website for the lab as well.
We do. If you search Human Performance Lab Guelph, you'll find us.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we try to translate some of our science up there if anybody's interested in sort of like lay summaries. Like it's not nerdy
Yes.
scientific talk. It's more like, hey, what do we do and what does it mean? We try to keep
Yes.
that relatively updated. So.
Yes, everyone should know that I was able to follow fairly easily. There are some graphs that I skimmed through really quickly, but otherwise it was very, very digestible. And as I mentioned, you have a Google Scholar page where there's lots of cool research, published research that you've done. I'm not going to let you go without doing some rapid fire with you.
Okay.
Let's start here. Finish the sentence. The key to optimizing performance in life is
Having goals. I think if
Mhm.
optimization is getting as close to that thing as possible, you better know what that thing is.
Yeah, love that. Agreed, 100%. This is a fully loaded question, but I'm asking it anyways. What is your favorite treat or cheat meal?
Ooh, you probably know this, but despite the idea that I'm like a fitness guy and my body is a temple, I actually don't eat clean all the time. But I would say candy is my that's my
Yeah.
kryptonite for sure.
Yeah, you're not a big foodie. Like we always laugh, Cass and I, that we're obsessed with food. Like we get very emotionally attached to food, and you just eat to like live. It's not you don't live to eat the way we do. But I do know of your fondness for candy, so that makes me feel better about you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I am kind of one of those weirdos that I eat for sustenance and I can
Yeah,
accidentally forget to eat. But yeah, we all
I
have our
cannot
vices.
I cannot relate at all. Okay, when you're not working out and you're not at work or in the gym or doing anything related, what do you enjoy doing in all that extra spare time you have?
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is a bit of a cheat, but I am really fond of like mountain biking and skiing and
Yes.
sort of those. It is sport, but it's about something that you have to be really focused in the moment. I like that. I like the idea of being made to feel small as well, like being in the
Mm.
mountains, surfing. I don't know. I just like that you have to be hyper focused on what you're doing and you're not thinking about other things, and that's sort of my
Yeah.
escape.
I mean, because your brain's always on. So maybe it's nice. Not that you're not using your brain when you're skiing or mountain biking, but it's probably nice for you just to go with the flow.
And oddly enough, I don't know if you can relate to this. Sometimes I find in those moments when I'm actually not thinking about a thing, I get the answer to a thing I couldn't solve. It's happened
Totally.
to me many times. I'd love to understand how that works. I'm not a psychologist, but
I don't know. This is why I watch mindless television. Like I watch reruns of shows I've seen 1,000 times. I don't really watch too much new television, with the exception of the documentaries I mentioned, but it's only because I just like to give my mind a rest and to see what happens when it's not in overdrive or overthinking as it
Yeah.
typically is.
Yeah.
Um, what is the biggest lesson you've learned in all your work and research that you've done over the years?
It's a good one. Sort of a mantra that I like, but I think there's some real truth to it that it's better to get it right than to be right.
Mm.
And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. When I was a postdoc, I really leaned into some research, looking at the vasculature. I won't bore you with the details, but I thought I had it all figured out. You know, I had just got my doctorate. We were pushing through. We'd done a couple studies that built on each other, and here was the answer. And then when I started as a professor, I essentially proved myself wrong, which sucked, right? Like we had published this, and like, hey, look at this, everybody. Um, but I think that's a good example of like in science, it's it is self-correcting. Other people are going to try those things we did, and it was better to be like, well, we now think this is the answer. For whatever reason, what we thought was true was not. And I think that's just an important way to approach a lot of things in life. Of like, it's not about my pride and my ego of like, oh my god, we made a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. Um, so yeah, I think that's an important way to think about things.
Yeah. It's good life advice. I mean, it's really what I adore about you is how you show up in that way, just trying to do the right thing and be the right type of guy doing the right things. I think it says a lot. It's not always easy, I'm sure, but you've really dedicated your life to finding answers, to pushing boundaries, to just being there doing the things to help people show up better in your work and in your family. And I really admire that about you. And I want to thank
Thank you.
you for taking the time to chat with me today. I'm going to get your wifey on this podcast one day. She doesn't know it yet and she'll hate it, but I'm going to do it anyways.
Can't wait.
I know we're going to talk about all the things yeah, but thank you. This was amazing. And I love watching the work that you're doing and the journey and just this new path you've created for yourself. And, I wish you guys all the best.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Marissa, and I will extend the same back to you. It's impressive watching what you're doing here, and I will continue to follow along.
Thanks, Jamie. We'll talk to you soon.